Even though they call it the news, most of it ends up just being noise and static. Well, here we're trying to find the signal. Welcome to Strange Frequency. And tonight's first story we call The Theater of Disclosure. According to Unexplained Mysteries, President Donald Trump has directed federal agencies, including the Department of Defense, to begin identifying and releasing government files related to UFOs, now referred to as UAPs. The article presents this as a significant development, a move toward transparency, a step toward disclosure. Defense officials have reportedly confirmed that agencies will begin reviewing records for potential release. No timeline has been provided, no inventory of documents has been published, no indication has been given as to what these files contain. And that's the story. Now let's step back, because this may not be about just what's in the files. It may be about the announcement itself. An announcement changes perception before evidence ever does. An order to review documents creates anticipation. Anticipation creates speculation. Speculation sustains attention, and attention sustains a story. This is where disclosure becomes theater. When a leader says we are releasing the files, the public hears momentum. But in reality, what begins is a process, a slow, procedural, carefully managed governmental process. Files must be located, classifications reviewed, redactions applied, approval signed. That can take months, sometimes years. And during that time, the idea of disclosure carries more weight than the documents themselves. But here's what we know. Announcements shape the narrative long before evidence appears. They move the conversation. They reset expectations. They signal responsiveness to public curiosity. Whether the context is extraordinary or mundane becomes secondary, at least initially. Now, is this insignificant? No. The subject of unidentified aerial phenomena has been clearly politically mainstream, probably the last 4 or 5 years. We heard a lot of it during COVID, especially. And it is no longer confined to just fringe speculation now. It is acknowledged at the highest levels of government. The shift alone is notable, but acknowledgement is not revelation. Momentum is not material, a directive not proof. And history tells us something important. Previous investigations into unidentified aerial phenomena have acknowledged anomalies. They have documented unexplained incidents, but they have stopped short of confirming anything extraterrestrial. If that pattern holds, what we may see in the coming months is not a seismic revelation, but an expansion of documentation. More reports, more summaries, more carefully framed language, and that raises a different question. If there were something truly paradigm shifting in those archives, something definitive, would it be introduced through a controlled review process? Or would it surface in a way that's far less orderly? Transformative revelations rarely arrive as scheduled announcements. They disrupt, they leak, they fracture. So tonight, what we have is not disclosure. What we have is movement, political movement, narrative movement, institutional acknowledgement that the subject carries weight. Whether that movement leads anywhere extraordinary remains to be seen. Until documents are released fully, clearly, materially, we're watching the staging of a process. And sometimes the staging tells us more about the power than the files ever will. And that's what we know. Our next article, Project Artichoke and Institutional Trust. According to declassified material referenced in the Daily Mail article, Project Artichoke was a CIA program in the early 1950s focused on interrogation methods and behavioral influence. It followed an earlier effort called Project Bluebird. The objective was to determine whether individuals could be compelled through hypnosis, drugs, or psychological techniques to act against their own will. Researchers experimented with LSD. They explored altered states of consciousness. They studied memory disruption and suggestibility. By 1953, the effort evolved and would later become known as MK Ultra. And that is not speculation. That is documented history. Now let's address the real tension here. The CIA is not a neutral institution in the public's mind. And that skepticism did not appear out of nowhere. Congressional investigations in the 1970s revealed that MK-Ultra involved non-consensual human experimentation. Records were destroyed, details were concealed, public trust was damaged. That part is not conspiracy theory. It is part of historical record. So when people hear mind control experiments, distrust is a natural response. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Governments, especially during the Cold War, pursued aggressive research in the name of national security. The fear of psychological warfare justified extreme curiosity. Curiosity led to experimentation. Experimentation crossed ethical lines. That history earned scrutiny. It earned skepticism. But skepticism must remain disciplined. Here's what we do not have evidence of. We do not have verified proof that Project Artichoke produced reliable, operational mind control capabilities. We have documentation of attempts, we have documentation of ethical failures, and we have documentation of secrecy. We do not have evidence of any type of mastery. And that is where nuance matters. Is it possible and historically accurate to say the CIA engaged in questionable and unethical experiments without leaping to the CIA perfected psychological domination of the human mind? There is a difference between misconduct and omnipotence. One is documented, the other is mythologized. Now here's the irony. An intelligence agency researching behavioral control while tightly controlling its own narrative. Trust erodes when transparency is selective, and selective transparency has defined much of history. So if viewers feel uneasy about Project Artichoke, the reaction is grounded in reality. It's understandable. The institution has made mistakes, serious ones at that, but responsible analysis means we separate what was attempted from what was actually proven. Here's what we know. Project Artichoke reflects Cold War paranoia and institutional ambition. It reflects ethical blind spots. It reflects secrecy. It does not, based on public evidence, reflect the successful creation of controllable human meat puppets. And that distinction protects us from drifting into fiction. Scrutinize institutions, demand accountability, and always question power, but anchor those questions to evidence. Otherwise, suspicion becomes performance and we lose clarity. And that's what we know. That's the signal. And we're going to round out this episode with a fan favorite, the Bermuda Triangle, science versus legend. According to popular mechanics, scientists continue to examine the long-standing mysteries surrounding the Bermuda Triangle, the region of the Atlantic Ocean historically linked to unexplained ship and aircraft disappearances. The article explores the idea that much of the triangle's reputation may be rooted in natural, measurable phenomena rather than the supernatural. Researchers point to extreme weather patterns, unpredictable ocean currents, powerful rogue waves capable of overwhelming large vessels. There was also discussion about methane hydrate releases from the ocean floor, which, in theory, could reduce water density and compromise buoyancy. The argument presented is not that every disappearance has been fully accounted for, rather, that the majority of incidents can be explained by environmental factors combined with human error, navigation challenges, and selective reporting. In other words, the mystery may be smaller than the legend. So let's hold up for a second. The Bermuda Triangle is a cultural phenomenon as much as a geographic one. For decades, books, television specials, and documentaries have framed it as a portal, an anomaly, a place where the rules simply stop applying. But science doesn't usually erase mystery, it reframes it. Extreme weather in the Atlantic is not unusual. The Gulf Stream is powerful. Storm systems can escalate quickly. Navigation technology decades ago was far less reliable than it is today. And when multiple variables converge, weather, current, human judgment, events that look supernatural can emerge from an entirely natural condition. Here's what's interesting. The Triangle gained fame during a time when sensational reporting sold stories. Disappearances were sometimes reported without context. Accidents outside the defined area were occasionally folded into the narrative. Patterns were drawn where coincidence may have been enough. That doesn't mean nothing unusual ever occurred. It means myth grows in the absence of data. And once myth grows, it resists correction. There's something very human in that, I think. Something relatable. We're drawn to the unexplained, though. We prefer the dramatic over the mundane. A rogue wave is powerful, but a dimensional rift is unforgettable. The article suggests that when modern technology, oceanography, and data modeling are applied, the triangle begins to look less like a supernatural hotspot and more like a high-risk maritime corridor. That shift doesn't make the ocean less dangerous, it makes it more understandable. And understandable doesn't diminish awe, it just grounds it. After tonight's previous segments, institutions, secrecy, power, this one reminds us that not every mystery hides intention. Sometimes it hides physics. Sometimes the signal is a conspiracy. Sometimes it's current. That's what we know. And that's tonight's signal. That concludes tonight's broadcast. Links to all the articles used will be in the description below. And as always, if you've seen anything strange or unexplained, feel free to reach out in the comments or by email. Until next time, we'll keep listening for the signal.